My name is Sheer, and I am a 42-year-old mother of 3 from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm Jewish, raised in a traditional household, and until January 18th, I had never claimed to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. I worked as a nurse, lived a quiet life, and by my own admission, rarely thought about spiritual matters beyond the tradition I was raised with. But just a few days ago, everything changed in a way that defies medical explanation and challenges everything we think we know about life, death, and what lies beyond. It was a Sunday afternoon, January 18th, 2026. I was at home preparing dinner for my family when I suddenly collapsed in my kitchen. There were no warning signs, no previous health issues, no indication that anything was wrong. My teenage daughter found me unresponsive on the floor and immediately called 911. By the time paramedics arrived, I had no pulse, no breathing, and no measurable brain activity. For 7 minutes and 43 seconds, I was clinically dead. As a nurse, I know exactly what those numbers mean. I know what happens to the brain after that much time without oxygen. But while the medical team worked frantically to revive my body, my consciousness was experiencing something that would forever alter my understanding of reality. I found myself standing in what I can only describe as the most beautiful garden I had ever seen. The colors there were not like the colors on Earth. They were alive, vibrating with a kind of internal light. I could hear the sound of the grass growing and the flowers breathing. It sounds strange to say, but I felt like I was finally home, in a place I had forgotten I belonged to. Then I was face to face with a man whose presence radiated such love and authority that I immediately knew who he was. Even though I had never accepted him as my Messiah, Jesus looked at me with eyes that seemed to see through my entire life, every moment, every choice, every secret thought. But instead of judgment, I felt overwhelming compassion. He didn't look like the paintings I had seen. His face was filled with a strength that felt like it could hold the weight of the universe, yet his touch was gentler than a mother's. He spoke to me not with audible words, but with a communication that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my soul. "Sheer," he said, "I have called you by name, and you are mine. Your people have waited for me, and now the time of their awakening draws near." As he spoke, the garden around us seemed to pulse with his voice. I felt every doubt I had ever carried as a Jewish woman, every question about the law, the prophets, and the promises, simply dissolve in his presence. He wasn't a stranger. He was the one we had been looking for all along. He extended his hand, and the moment I took it, the garden around us transformed. It was as if the ground became transparent, and we were standing on a vast observation deck overlooking the earth. This wasn't the earth as we see it from a plane or a satellite. This was earth as it exists in the spiritual realm. I could see every prayer rising like a thin silver cord toward heaven. I saw acts of love as bright bursts of gold and deeds of darkness as heavy, oily shadows flowing across the continents. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. I saw how much power a simple, kind word has in the spirit, and how much damage a hidden lie can do. Jesus pointed toward a specific region that I recognized as the Middle East. "Look," he said, "the first sign will come from the land of my birth. After January 31st, there will be a discovery that shakes the archaeological world. They will find evidence of my earthly ministry that cannot be disputed, cannot be hidden, and cannot be explained away by skeptics." As he spoke, the vision zoomed in on a dry, rocky area near Jerusalem. I saw a team of workers who looked exhausted and dusty. They were digging in a location that had been overlooked for centuries, a hidden chamber tucked away beneath layers of ancient stone and debris. I watched as one man's shovel hit something solid. The air in the vision felt heavy with anticipation. They began to clear away the dirt with small brushes, and I saw their faces change. It started with confusion, then moved to shock, and finally to a kind of holy fear. They were uncovering artifacts that bore undeniable proof of Christ's presence in that region 2,000 years ago. These weren't just old pots or coins. I saw scrolls that had been perfectly preserved in jars that looked like they were made of a material speck. Science doesn't fully understand yet. I saw personal items that belonged to the disciples. Simple things, a wooden staff with markings, a leather sandal, a copper ring, but they were infused with a residue of power that made the archaeologists' hands tremble. The most shocking thing, though, was a stone tablet that contained an eyewitness account of the resurrection. written by someone who had been a staunch enemy of the believers. It wasn't just words. There was a physical evidence attached to it, a fabric that had been used in the burial process that still held a faint, that glowing image of a man. As a nurse, I've seen enough to know what's medically possible, but this fabric defied every law of physics. It looked like it had been scorched by a light more intense than the sun, yet the fibers were perfectly intact. Jesus told me, "This discovery will divide the world. Those who have been waiting for truth will rejoice, but those who profit from darkness will rage." I watched as the news of this discovery began to spread. I saw newsrooms in London, New York, and Tokyo in a state of absolute chaos. Journalists were arguing, trying to find a way to debunk it. I saw scientists in laboratories running tests on the artifacts, their faces turning pale as the results came back. Every test proved the items were authentic. Every test proved they were from the exact time and place the Bible describes. I saw a famous atheist philosopher sitting alone in his study, looking at the images on his computer screen. He was weeping. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. The evidence was so clear that his entire worldview was crumbling. But I also saw people in high positions of power, government officials and media moguls, gathering in dark rooms, whispering about how to suppress the story. They were afraid that if people believed the truth, they would lose their control. They tried to claim the artifacts were fakes, planted by religious extremists. They tried to bury the story on the back pages of websites and cut the feeds of anyone sharing the truth. But Jesus showed me that it wouldn't work. Truth has a way of spreading like wildfire when its time has come, he said. I saw ordinary people using their phones to share photos and videos of the site. I saw a young girl in a remote village in South America looking at a grainy image of the burial cloth and feeling a surge of faith that healed her sick heart. I saw an elderly man in a nursing home reading about the scrolls and finally finding the peace he had been searching for his whole life. The discovery wasn't just about history. It was a bridge. It was a way for people who needed logic and proof to finally let down their guard. I saw people who had spent their whole lives mocking religion suddenly falling to their knees, not because they were afraid, but because they finally saw that the love they had always hoped for was real and documented. I saw a group of Jewish rabbis gathered around a table, looking at the inscriptions from the scrolls. Their eyes were wide with realization. They began to compare the words found in the cave with the ancient prophecies of the Tanakh. One by one, they started to nod. They were seeing the connections they had missed for generations. The evidence was so specific, so tied to the geography and the culture of the time, that there was no other conclusion to reach. The Messiah they had been waiting for had already come, and he was coming again. As I watched this unfold, I felt a deep sense of urgency. The January 31st date felt like a starting gun. It wasn't just a discovery of the past. It was a signal for the future. The world was about to be forced to make a choice. There would be no more room for maybe or perhaps. The evidence would be so overwhelming that to deny it would require a deliberate act of the will to stay in the dark. I saw the light from these artifacts beginning to pierce through the oily shadows I had seen earlier. Every time someone accepted the truth of the discovery, a new stream of silver light would shoot up from the earth. The spiritual landscape was changing. The darkness was pushing back, trying to cover the light with lies and distractions, but the light was more persistent. It was a beautiful, slow-motion battle of truth against deception. As the first vision of the archaeological discovery began to fade, Jesus turned to me with an expression that I can still see when I close my eyes. It was a look that mixed a deep, radiant joy with a heavy, piercing sorrow. It reminded me of how I feel as a mother when I have to watch my children go through a difficult surgery, knowing the pain is necessary for the healing, but wishing I could bear it for them. "My daughter?" he said, and the weight of his voice made my spirit tremble. "What you will see next will be difficult, but it is necessary. The second event will test the faith of many, but it will also purify my church." The scene shifted instantly. We were no longer looking at the dusty ruins of the Middle East. Suddenly, we were hovering above what appeared to be a massive global gathering of people. I could see that these were Christians from every denomination, every background, and every nation. It was like looking at a sea of souls, and at first it looked beautiful, millions of people singing and praying. But as I looked closer, Jesus opened my spiritual eyes to see the reality beneath the surface. He told me that between February 20th and February 25th, he would allow a testing to come upon his people. He called it a great shaking. I watched as a vibration started to move through this massive crowd. It wasn't a physical earthquake that knocked down buildings, but a spiritual one that shook the very core of people's hearts. I saw huge ornate cathedrals and massive megachurches that looked like shining palaces from the outside. But as the shaking intensified, I saw that many of these buildings were sitting on foundations of loose, shifting sand. Some of the sand was labeled greed, others pride, and some were labeled the praise of men. When the vibration hit, these massive structures began to crack. I watched as some believers stood firm, their feet planted on what looked like glowing white bedrock. No matter how hard the ground shook, they didn't move. Their faith was unshakable because it wasn't tied to a building or a famous personality. It was tied directly to the Word of God. But then I saw others, thousands of them, who began to stumble and fall away. They were clutching onto things that couldn't save them. Jesus pointed to a famous pastor standing on a stage behind a glass pulpit. To the natural eye, he looked successful and holy. But in the spirit, I could see through his chest. His heart was like a withered fruit, and inside his pockets were silver chains that stretched out and connected to the bank accounts of the poor people in his congregation. As the dates of February 20th to 25th approached in the vision, a light from heaven began to shine directly on him. It was a piercing, honest light that he couldn't hide from. I saw the moment his secrets were revealed. It wasn't just a rumor. It was the truth coming out in a way that could not be denied. I saw him being led away in handcuffs, his face filled with a mixture of terror and rage. I saw his financial crimes, his secret lives, and his moral failures laid bare for the whole world to see. And it wasn't just him. I saw this happening in cities all across America and the world. It was as if a giant hand was pulling back the curtains on stage after stage, showing the rot that had been hidden behind the beautiful scenery. I saw mega churches splitting apart in an instant. Congregations that had been thousands strong were suddenly reduced to a few dozen people. I watched as people walked out of these buildings, looking dazed and heartbroken. They had discovered that their leaders had been teaching a prosperity gospel, a message that promised them wealth and ease, instead of the true gospel of salvation and sacrifice. I saw people throwing their leather-bound books by these famous authors into the trash, realizing they had been fed husks instead of bread. Jesus wept as he watched these false shepherds lead his sheep astray. His tears were like liquid light, and where they fell on the earth, I saw a new kind of growth begin to sprout. This purification is not punishment, he told me softly. It is preparation. My bride must be spotless before the wedding feast. The chaff must be separated from the wheat. Those who remain will be stronger, purer, and more effective in the harvest that is coming. I began to see a different side of the vision. While the massive palaces were crumbling, I saw small, humble lights flickering in the darkness. These were house churches, families gathering in living rooms, co-workers meeting in break rooms, students praying in parks. They didn't have light shows or expensive sound systems. They just had the Bible and a hunger for authentic fellowship. I saw a group of people in a small apartment in a crowded city. They were sharing a simple meal and reading the scriptures together. As they prayed, I saw the same glowing white bedrock beneath their floorboards that I had seen under the faithful believers earlier. They weren't afraid of the shaking. In fact, the shaking seemed to make them glow brighter. I saw them reaching out to the heartbroken people who had left the crumbling megachurches, taking them in and showing them what it really meant to follow Jesus. I saw a vision of a young man who had been a social media influencer for a large church. He was used to the fame and the lights, but during those 5 days in February, he felt a conviction so deep it felt like a physical weight. I saw him get on his knees in his bedroom and delete his accounts, repenting for seeking his own glory instead of God's. He started a small prayer group in his local neighborhood, and the power that came out of that small group was 10 times greater than anything he had experienced on a stage. I saw a grandmother in a rural village who had been praying for her local church for 40 years. The church had become cold and formal, more interested in politics than in souls. During the shaking, the leadership was exposed for their corruption and the church doors were locked. But that grandmother didn't stop. She opened her front porch and I saw the youth of the town flocking to her. They were tired of the fake stuff. They wanted the real thing she had. The vision showed me that this purification was global. I saw underground churches in countries where it's illegal to be a Christian. They weren't shaking because they had already been through the fire. They were the ones who were going to help the Western church learn how to stand. I saw a spiritual bridge being built between the suffering church and the shaking church, where the strong were reaching out to help the weak. I saw Jesus walking among the people who were left standing. He wasn't looking at their clothes or their titles. He was looking at their hands and their hearts. I saw him touch the eyes of a young woman who had been disillusioned by a fallen leader. As he touched her, the scales fell from her eyes, and she saw him for the first time, not as a character in a sermon, but as a living, breathing Savior. She began to sing a song I had never heard, a melody that felt like it was woven from the stars. The air around the faithful began to change. It became thick with the presence of God. It wasn't the kind of excitement you feel at a concert. It was a deep, heavy peace. I saw that the people who survived the shaking were being equipped with a new kind of authority. They didn't need to shout to be heard. When they spoke, the atmosphere shifted. Jesus pointed to the remnant, the group that remained after the chaff had been blown away. These are the ones who have built their lives on the solid rock of my word, he said. They will shine brighter than ever before. The world will try to ignore them, but they will be impossible to miss. I saw that this shaking was also happening inside individuals. It wasn't just about leaders. I saw casual Christians, people who went to church out of habit, but lived like the world the rest of the week, suddenly faced with a choice. The shaking forced them to decide if they really believed what they said they did. Many of them realized they didn't, and they walked away. But many others fell on their faces and finally gave their whole lives to him. It was a painful process of stripping away everything that wasn't real. I saw a businessman who had used his faith as a way to get more clients. During the shaking, he lost his business. He was devastated, but then he found himself sitting in a small house church, crying his eyes out, realizing that he had finally found the treasure he was actually looking for. He didn't have the money anymore, but he had a joy that made him look like a different person. I saw Jesus look out over the world after the shaking of February 25th was over. The landscape looked different. The massive, dark shadows of religious corruption were gone. The glittering, fake lights of the prosperity gospel had been extinguished. What was left were thousands upon thousands of small, intense fires burning all over the globe. It looked like a map of the stars reflected on the earth. He turned to me, and his eyes sparkled with that joy I mentioned before. Now, he said, the bride is getting ready. The stage is set for what must come next. I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The weight of the sorrow was gone, replaced by an intensity that felt like a storm was about to break. I knew that the purification was just the beginning. It was the clearing of the ground so that something new and massive could be built. I felt my own heart being searched in that moment, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about being good or religious was nothing compared to the raw, honest fire I was seeing in the eyes of the Son of Man. As the second vision concluded, I felt a massive shift in the atmosphere around us. The air became charged with electricity, a hum that I could feel in my very bones, vibrating through my spirit. I sensed that what I was about to see would be even more significant than anything that had come before. It felt as though the previous events were just the labor pains, and now the birth was truly beginning. Jesus turned to me, his voice carrying a weight that made my spirit tremble. The third event, he said, will affect every person on earth, believer and unbeliever alike. It will be a sign in the heavens that cannot be ignored, cannot be explained by science, and cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The observation deck where we stood suddenly expanded, giving us a view of the entire solar system. It was breathtaking. I could see the planets like precious jewels suspended in the velvet blackness of space. Then, my breath caught in my throat. I saw something approaching from the outer reaches of the system. It wasn't a comet or an asteroid. It didn't have the jagged, cold edges of a rock. It was something that seemed to be made of pure, living light, moving with a clear purpose and intelligence toward Earth. On March 3rd, Jesus continued, this messenger of light will position itself between Earth and the Sun for exactly 3 hours and 33 minutes. During this time, the light that reaches Earth will be different. It will carry with it frequencies that will awaken dormant spiritual senses in those who are ready to receive them. I watched in amazement as this celestial visitor took its position. As a nurse, I've seen all kinds of lighting in hospitals. Harsh fluorescence, dim night lights. But this was nothing like anything I had ever seen. The light that bathed the earth during those 3 hours wasn't the normal yellow sunlight. Instead, it was a brilliant, pearlescent white light tinged with gold. It didn't just hit the surface of things, it seemed to penetrate through them. I could see the effect it was having on people all over the planet. In the middle of the day in some places, and in the middle of the night in others, this light was felt. Even those indoors or underground were not exempt. The spiritual frequency of this light passed through every physical barrier. I saw individuals falling to their knees in spontaneous worship in the middle of busy streets. Their eyes were being opened to spiritual realities they had never perceived before. They weren't just seeing the world, they were seeing the life behind the world. I saw a group of scientists in an observatory, frantic and confused. They were staring at their monitors, their instruments spinning wildly. They were trying to find a physical explanation for the eclipse, searching for some cosmic anomaly to blame it on, but their machines couldn't capture the essence of what was happening. One of the younger scientists simply sat back, took off his glasses, and began to weep. He realized that what he was witnessing was the fingerprint of the Creator, something that surpassed all human equations. Children seemed particularly sensitive to this new light. I saw a playground in a suburb where the children suddenly stopped playing. They weren't afraid. They were enchanted. Many of them began to demonstrate gifts of healing, placing their small hands on each other or on their teachers, and I saw physical ailments simply vanish. I saw a little boy who had been mute his whole life suddenly open his mouth and begin to speak beautiful, poetic words of prophecy that amazed his parents. But as Jesus had warned, not everyone was receiving this light positively. I observed that those who had hardened their hearts against God, those who had spent their lives building walls of pride and bitterness, were experiencing intense discomfort. To them, the light felt like a burning fire. Some became violently ill, their bodies reacting to the purity of the light. Others flew into inexplicable rages, lashing out at anything holy or good. Many simply retreated to dark places, basements, windowless rooms, or deep forests, where they hoped to escape the penetrating illumination. This light will separate the sheep from the goats, Jesus explained. It will reveal the true condition of every human heart. Those who have secretly served darkness will be exposed, while those who have walked in my light will be empowered like never before. The vision of the third event was so overwhelming that I felt my consciousness begin to fade. The sheer glory of it almost too much for my spirit to hold. But Jesus placed a hand on my shoulder, and immediately I felt a surge of renewed strength. There is one more thing you must see, he said, and his tone carried an urgency that made me focus completely. The fourth event will be the most significant of all, and it will determine the course of human history for the remainder of this age. The entire spiritual realm around us seemed to hold its breath. I sensed that this was the culmination, the final movement of a great symphony. The fourth vision began on April 11th, 2026. I found myself standing with Jesus on a mountaintop, looking out at cities across America, and then expanding to show the entire world. But this was no ordinary view. I could see into the spiritual realm overlaid on the physical world. Jesus pointed to specific locations where something extraordinary was beginning. Look closely, he told me, and see how I am calling my people home. What I saw next defied all conventional understanding of how God moves. In cities everywhere, ordinary believers, and even those who didn't yet believe, were experiencing supernatural encounters that were impossible to ignore. These weren't public spectacles, they were intimate, personal visitations happening in the privacy of homes, workplaces, and dreams. I saw a businessman in Tokyo, a man who lived for his career and his status. He was sitting in his office late at night, surrounded by glass and steel, when suddenly the room filled with a presence so powerful he fell to his knees. He wasn't a Christian. He had never stepped foot in a church. But in that moment, he saw his whole life from heaven's perspective. He saw the emptiness of his pursuit and the reality of the love that was calling him. He wept with a relief he couldn't explain, surrendering his life right there on the office floor. Simultaneously, I saw a Muslim woman in Cairo praying in her home. As she bowed, a vision of Jesus appeared before her. It wasn't a scary thing. It was like the sun rising in her living room. Despite the danger she knew she would face, she felt an immediate, unshakable peace. Her conversion was instant. She didn't need a sermon. She had met the Word himself. In Mumbai, I saw a Hindu professor reading ancient texts. As he read, the words on the page began to glow with that same pearlescent light I had seen on March 3rd. He heard a voice speaking directly to his heart, explaining the true nature of God in a way that his intellect could finally grasp. His years of searching ended in a single moment of revelation. I saw a soldier in a war zone sitting in a trench, tired and cynical. Suddenly, the air around him filled with the fragrance of flowers, the same fragrance I smelled in the garden. He saw an angelic figure standing guard over him, and he heard a whisper telling him that he was loved and that his life had a purpose beyond the violence. He dropped his weapon and began to pray for his enemies. But it wasn't just unbelievers. Christians who had grown cold were receiving wake-up calls. I saw a pastor in Atlanta who had been going through the motions for years. He was preparing a sermon, looking for something clever to say, when suddenly his study filled with light. He heard Jesus speak to him about the condition of his heart, about how he had started to love the ministry more than the master. The encounter was so powerful that he spent the next 3 days in tears. When he finally stood to preach that Sunday, he didn't use notes. The entire congregation was transformed by the power resting on him. Jesus explained that this global awakening was not random. The harvest is ready, he told me, and I am calling my laborers into the field. But this harvest will be unlike anything the world has ever seen. It will not depend on human organization or religious institutions. It will be a movement of my spirit that transcends denominational boundaries and cultural barriers. The speed of these transformations was incredible. I saw people abandoning lucrative but dishonest careers to serve their communities. I saw families that had been broken for decades being restored overnight as husbands and wives encountered God's love. I saw a famous actress on a movie set in Hollywood who began to weep uncontrollably during a scene. She couldn't explain it to the crew, but she knew God was calling her. Within days, she had walked away from a multi-million-dollar contract to share her testimony. Social media was flooded with these stories. I saw people posting videos of their encounters, their faces glowing with a light that no filter could produce. Even though government officials in some countries tried to suppress the news and arrest those who shared their stories, it was like trying to stop the tide with a broom. Jesus showed me the resistance too. Religious leaders who felt threatened by this grassroots movement began to speak out, calling it mass hysteria or deception. The enemy is not idle, he warned. I saw counterfeit, supernatural experiences being promoted to confuse people. False prophets arose with signs and wonders that didn't come from heaven, trying to draw people away. But Jesus assured me, those who know my voice will not be deceived. The fruit of genuine encounters will always be repentance, humility, love for others, and a burning desire to share the gospel. I watched as the economic world shifted. Wealthy individuals who met Jesus during this time began liquidating their assets. I saw huge sums of money being poured into feeding the hungry, building hospitals, and funding missions. Corporations that had been built on unethical practices began to collapse as their leaders, struck by conviction, confessed their wrongs and stepped down. The most beautiful thing I saw was the breaking down of barriers. In churches, I saw people of all races and backgrounds embracing. In other parts of the world, ancient tribal conflicts were being resolved as former enemies recognized each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. I saw a vision of a border where two warring factions were standing. Instead of firing, they began to walk toward each other, laid down their guns, and began to pray together. Jesus explained that this global revival was both a fulfillment of prophecy and a final call. "This is my mercy," he said. My final invitation for people to come into the ark before the storms of judgment begin. Those who respond to this call will be equipped and prepared for what is coming next. As the fourth vision began to conclude, Jesus turned to me with an expression of both love and urgency. "Daughter, you must understand that time is running out. The window of opportunity I am opening will not remain open indefinitely. Those who hear these words must not delay in responding to my call." He then gave me specific instructions about sharing what I had seen. "Do not worry about those who will mock or disbelieve. Speak to those whose hearts are already prepared to receive this message. My sheep know my voice, and they will recognize the truth in what you have experienced." The weight of this responsibility was almost overwhelming, but Jesus reassured me. "I will be with you every step of the way. When you speak my words, I will confirm them with signs and wonders. Those who are meant to hear will hear, and those who are meant to respond will respond." As our conversation concluded yesterday, January 24th, 2026, I looked at David with tears in my eyes and said, "David, I know how this all sounds. 1 week ago today, if someone had told me a story like this, I would have thought they were delusional. But I can't deny what I experienced. Jesus is real. He's coming back soon, and he wants everyone to know that there's still time to accept his invitation of salvation." The urgency in my heart is unmistakable. Today is January 25th, 2026, and I have spent the last few days in prayer, asking God to help me be a faithful witness to what I saw in those 7 minutes and 43 seconds on January 18th. I know the dates are close. I know the shaking is coming in February, but I also know the beauty of the light that follows in March and the awakening in April. Type amen in the comments if this message has stirred something in your spirit. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, we're not just watching prophecy unfold. We have the privilege of participating in it. The greatest adventure in human history is about to begin. Make sure you're ready.